Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Pehei Moadim L'Simcha. We're going to get started with a review. We started with yesterday's daf on Pei Dalet Amud Bet at the very top with this opinion that Breita that says you don't bring bikurim from places where the fruits don't grow well, okay, in the valleys and in the hills. Then Ula said, and if you do, it's not sanctified. To which we had Rabbi Acha Bar Abba, who basically raised difficulty and seemed to disagree. Then, even though we resolved the difficulty, it seemed there were two approaches. And then the Gemara said, by the way, these two approaches can be found also in Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan holds like Ula. They're not sanctified at all. Rish Lakish holds that they are. And then we brought both the reasons behind them, and then we brought two Braitot. One says you bring and you read. The other says you bring and you don't read the Mikra Bikurim, right? The text that you're supposed to say with the Bikurim. But they both seem to indicate that you bring the Bikurim. And how does this work in, right? We ended with the top of Peyam and Aleph, El Rabbi Yochanan Kasha. According to Rish Lakish, we reconciled and said, well, there's different kinds of things that grow in the roof, depending on whether it's the roof of a cave or the roof of a house. And then we distinguished in all the other cases as well. The four cases, the Gag, right? The roof, the ruins, the boat, and the plant. So, right, where it's in a planter. So then we said, but Rabbi Yochanan Kasha, because Rabbi Yochanan doesn't think you're supposed to bring them at all. So what are we talking about here that you bring and you don't read, or you bring and you read? To which the Gemara answers tonight. It's actually a Tannaitic debate. Tanya, shebegag v'shebechorva mevi v'koreh, shebatzis v'shebesfina ino mevi kol ikar. This is a bit of a strange writer to prove Rabbi Yochanan's opinion and that he's based in a Tannaitic source. But if we look at the end right now, let's start with the end and then we'll go back to the beginning. It brings two out of the four cases, the plant and in the boat. And here you see there's a third opinion, that in those two you don't bring at all. How do you explain the Garag and the Chorva, Meviva Kore? Not only do you bring, but you actually read. So you'd have to say that according to Rabbi Yochanan, we must be talking about a gag, a roof that's of a cave, let's say, and a chorva, a ruin that was cultivated, places where it actually grows well. And in those places, then obviously you're obligated to bikurim. But if it was a gag or chorva that was more similar to the plant and the boat, then you wouldn't bring it all. Okay, and that just proves there's some other Tannaitic opinion. It seems like there's a range now of three opinions, or maybe just the difference between the first two is, as we explained, Rish Lakish, depends on the level. And then we have this third that you don't bring at all. Okay, and then we learned in the Mishnah that you have to bring the best of your stuff. Okay, so now, right, we're talking about, if we go back to the Mishnah, Koral Korbanot Zibur, you bring from the Aretz and Chutz Aretz, Min Chadash Min Yasham, but the Omer and Shtei Alechem only come from Chadash and only from the land. And then they said, but all of these you bring from the best. So now the Gemara is going to say, Amrele, Yochana, Umamre. Okay, then we said, by the way, where are the places, right? The Gemara continued, the Mishnah continued, it said, Machnes v'Zatra is the best for Solet. And then there's Aforaim in the Bika. So now we're going to talk about Aforaim, and we're going to see a story where Aforaim comes into play. It's kind of a midrash of a conversation between Moshe and Moshe Rabbeinu and the Chartumim, the magicians in Pharaoh. Okay, another Pesach connection. So Amrele Yochana, if you remember, they had the whole showdown where they did their magic, Moshe did his magic. They did their, right? And then we had the back and forth. And whatever they did, Moshe did, right? Whatever Moshe did, they did until Moshe's, right, staff swallowed up, the snake swallowed up all the others. So basically, we have a background conversation to this. Amrle Yochana Umamre, those are the two names of the magicians of Pharaoh, LeMoshe. They say to Moshe, Teven Samachnis La'Afraim. Okay, they use this phrase, this idiom, which is you're bringing wheat grains to Opharaim. Okay, in other words, we are the place of magic. Why are you bringing these signs? Right, when Moshe came and brought the signs, they said, why are you bringing signs to Egypt? We're the ones who are the specialists in signs and magic. And what are you doing here? Okay, and what does it see here? What's the phrase? Are you bringing grains to Ephraim? That's the place that's known to have the best grains. What? You're bringing your grains to sell in Ephraim? What are you bringing them to sell? In Ephraim, when we've got tons of grains as it is, and the best. Amar lehu. So what is Moshe's response to them? Amri nashe lamata yarka shkol. So people say when you have a city where they're selling vegetables, go sell your vegetables there. In other words, that's the place everyone goes to buy tevin. They know I'm going to go to sell my stuff in the place where it's the best place to be selling grains because everybody goes there to buy grains. So of course I'm going to sell, right? People go to Turkey to buy rugs. So if I'm going to go sell rugs, that's the best place to sell because the most people are coming there and that's what they're looking for. Okay. So if you go back to, okay, so what, now, what's Moshe basically saying to them? Right, if I want to show God's uniqueness, I'm going to show the magic, the signs that God can bring in a place where they'll appreciate it, right? You can see it like that. They'll understand. And when I show you down and I can do something that you can't, then obviously, then I'll be able to prove it to you because your whole people, they believe in this magic and then they'll see God's greatness compared to, what you can do. Okay, new Mishnah. Ein mevi'im lo mibeit hazvalim, v'lo mibeit hashlachim, v'lo mibeit ha'ilan. Okay, again, other things that you can, now there's a machloket here. Are we talking about all menachot? Or are we talking a machloket between the commentaries? Or are we talking about specifically the Shtei Alechem and the Omer? That's a debate among the commentaries. Debate Rashi Tosfot. Okay, you can look. Tosfot says, b'chol menachot ka'amrinan. And Rashi Ketav Yad says, Omer and Shtei Alechem. Anyway, we can't bring whichever one, okay, or maybe all of them. Not from a Beit HaZvalim, which Rashi has two interpretations. We'll go with the first, which is a place where they need fertilizer, because it already shows the land's not great if it needs fertilizer. Some people say Rashi brings a second, which is, well, it really smells bad and it ruins, it's gross. Velomi Beit HaShlachim, not from a field that needs irrigating. Velomi, but it isn't sustainable by rainwater alone. Velomi Beit HaIlan, and not from a place where there's trees because the trees suck up the nutrients or create shade. So stuff's not going to grow as well, or you can't count on it because it's relying on external things to make it better. V'imevi kasher, but if you brought from there, it's okay. Ketzad oseh. So now how do you plant the field in order for it to produce? Okay, these are the fields that they wanted to get the crops from. If you want to produce the best crops, here's the advice. Nera shana rishona, uvashnia, uvashana shnia. Okay, this is hard to read because it depends. We're going to see there's two ways to read this sentence. So I don't know how to read it now, but I'll read it one way and then later we'll see the other way. You plow it for 1 year. Ubashana shnia, and on the second year, zorah kodem lepesach shivim yom. You plant it before Pesach 70 days. V'hu aseh solet miruba. And that brings out a lot of solet, and then you'll have a lot of solet for your menachot, for your shtei alechem, for your omer. Okay, it's sad because what you've done is you've let it lay fallow for a year, and that's going to make a better crop. Ketzad bodek. How do you check that the solet is properly that it's actually solet in the way that you need it for the mincha offerings? Hagizbar machnis yado letocha. Okay, after you've sifted it, okay, there's the process of how many times you have to sift it, but after you've sifted it, the last time, machnis yado letocha, ala ba'avak psula ad sheyinafena. So what they would do is usually when you sift it, right, it keeps the bad stuff at the top and then the good stuff comes out the bottom. But when it comes to the later stage of the sifting with this solet is this very fine, it's actually not such a fine flour, I should really say. Usually we call it fine flour, but it's not really. It's actually granular, like sand. And what you do is in the last sifter, what happens is the way we have flour, it's very powdery. Now we don't want powdery. Right? And it's all it's not sandy, granular at all. You actually don't want flour like that. The solet, when you put it in the last sieve, basically the powder comes out and the good stuff stays at the top. And you're left with, at the top, the granular type because all the powder comes out. If it's powdery still, so you put your hand in, right? Like if you put your hand in flour, it's going to come out very powdery. If you put your hand in and it's powdery, then you know it's not good and you have to put it back into that last sieve and let all the powder come out, and then you're left with the good stuff. So that's what it means, ala ba'avak. If there's a powder coming out, it's psula, it's disqualified ad yinafena, until yinafena means put it back in the sieve one more time and get out all the powder. V'im it's li'ah psula, and if it has worms in it, it's disqualified. That's pretty clear. Ketzad osa. Okay, so now the Gemara starts with the words Ketzad osan nira shana rishona. Now we're going to see two readings of that line. It depends where you put the comma. Ready? Ibailu hechi kamar. How do you read this? Nira shana rishona ushnia nira v'zorah. Do you plow it the first year, let it lay fallow, then plow it again the second year, and then plant it? Now, that's not how we read it, because we took a break after Nera Shana Rishona, plow it the first year, Uva Shana Shniya, and on the second year, plant before Pesach, 70 days. Didn't say you plowed it. But you could read it like this. Nera Shana Rishona Uva Shana Shniya, end in the second year, and then Zorah Kodem LePesach Shevim Yom. Plow it the first year and the second year, and then plant it 70 days before Pesach. Okay, so that's the first way they read it here. Or like we read it, plow it the first year, and then the second year, don't plow it at all, and just plant it 70 days before Pesach. Tashma, so let's learn from here. Ditanya, it says in a Braita, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Af chitei karzim ukfar achim, okay, these two other locations, the grains from there, ilmales muchot Yerushalayim hayu mevi'im mehen. Were they closer to Jerusalem, they would have brought from them also, meaning they also have great grains there. But we don't bring it from there because they're not near Jerusalem, and we only bring from Sadot Hamud Ramot that are south-facing fields, and ones that were specifically plowed for the sake of the Omer, okay, or the Shtei Alechem. So basically, we have these special fields. Some people say even maybe the Menachot, and if we go with Tosfos, all the Menachot, they have to be south-facing because that gets the most sunlight, and they have to be plowed for the sake of the mitzvah. Because on the south side, that gets the most sun. The sun rises, and it's facing there, and then when it sets, it's also on the south side. Now, this is the part of the Braita that we wanted. So you plow it the first year. Nera and choresh seem to be the same word. I'm not sure the same meaning. I don't know why they're repeating and why they're switching words. But you plow it the first year. Then the second year you plow it, also in the beginning of the year, and then you repeat the plowing. This actually says there's two plowings in the second year. And it sounds like you're plowing in the beginning of the year, and then just before 7 days before Pesach, when you're about to plant, you plow it one more time. Okay, you want to have it planted when it's going to get warm soon. So that's why you wait till 70 days before Pesach. If you do it like this, you're going to have, now usually the stalks are long, and the shibolet, which is where you have the ears, is where you have the grains, is usually short. But if you do it this way, you're going to end up with a kaneh, which is a zeret. That's about half an amma. Remember, the amma is from the elbow to the end of the middle finger. So about half that length. And you're going to have double that length of the shibolet. Okay? That's going to be a much better product. Okay, this reminds us of Chot Shabbat with all the malachot. Okay? And then you cut it, you put it in a pile, you thresh it, you winnow it, you thresh it is trampling it, you trample all the stalks so that okay, let me explain a little better. First you cut them, then you put them all in a big pile. Then you take the pile and you start threshing it. You pound on them on the ground. Then that separates the wheat from the chaff. Then you end up with zoreh, you winnow, and then the chaff blows away. You're left with the grains. Borer, you separate them out, right? You separate the good from the bad. Tochen, you ground it. Meraked, you sift it. And mevi etzel gizbar, and then you bring it to the gizbar. Gizbar machnis yado letochan. Then when you bring it to the gizbar, after you've done the sifting, the gizbar puts his hand in. Again, what's he trying to check? Is it powdery or not? Right? Does it have the right consistency? We don't want it to be powdery. We want it to be granular. Im al taba avak, if there was powder, omer lo chazor v'napeo tashniya. He says, go back and sift it again. Mishum Rabbi Natan Amru, he had a different way of dealing with it. Gizbar sach yado shemen u'machnis letocha ad shemala kol avka. He gets rid of the powder in a different way. You put a little oil on his hands. The gizbar is the treasurer. I'm not sure why he was in charge of this, or maybe it just means the person who was in charge of this job would put his hand in with some oil on it, and the oil would collect the powder, and that would fix the solet, so it would be the proper consistency. And until all the powder got out of it. Okay. Anyway, the point being here, why did we bring this? Remember, we brought this because we wanted to say, how does it work with the plowing? It says there, you plow the first year, and then you plow the second year, and then you do it a second time in the second year. So obviously it means you plow second year. So that would explain our Mishnah. You must plow the second year as well. But the Gemara says there's something weird here because lit amech, according to what you're saying, manitin lo katane shonet. The Mishnah definitely doesn't say you do it twice in the second year. So maybe this Bright has a completely different opinion and doesn't agree with our Mishnah. And right, Braita katane shonet, turning now to Amabet, the Braita says shonet, you do it a second time. So they say halokashya, kam ba'avudah, kam b'she'en avudah. It really depends whether it was cultivated or not cultivated. If it was cultivated, then you don't need to do it a second time, and that's our Mishnah. But if it wasn't a cultivated field, then you would need to do it twice in the second year, and that's the Braita. But in the end, the point being that the Braita does say do it again the second year, and so does and therefore we read our Mishnah in that way. But it's not 100% clear, and therefore the Gemara says, "My have Allah." So really, what do you do? Is it true? Is that clear? Maybe it really does contradict. Maybe this represents a different opinion. Maybe that's not what our Mishnah means. So they bring another source, Tashma, Detanya. It says in a Braita, Nar chetzia v'zoreh chetzia, nar chetzia v'zoreh chetzia. Okay, this sounds there's a little bit of an interesting interpretation of the way the commentaries go with this. Nar chetzia means plow the first half of the year, not plow half the field. The first word chetzia means half the year. The second one means half the field. Okay, so that's why it's a little confusing. Plow for the first half of the year, then plant in half the field the first year. Now, you're not going to take the crop from the first year because it hasn't laid fallow for a year. But what you're going to do is the next year you're going to be nar chetzia. You're going to plow for the first half of the year, and then zoreh chetzia, and then you're going to plant the other half. And then basically every other year you're going to plant in one half of the field. So, and that's going to produce the best product. Anyway, the point being here, what do you see? That every year you plow the field. So from there, we get to this idea that you must, even the Mishnah must say the same. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ein mevi'im et ha'omer ela min hasadot hamudramot shebe'eretz Yisrael. Okay, we see this again. This idea, Rabbi Yochanan says the same thing we saw before, has to be from a south-facing field, shebahen chama zorachet and mahem chama shokat, because the sun is mostly on the south side most of the day. Tanya nami hachi, a Braita to support this. Abba Shaul Omer hayaba mibik'at beit mikla, kibat shalosh se'in aita. Okay, the Omer would come from this particular place, the bik'ah of beit mikla. It was about 3 se'im. V'sadeh mudremet aita. It was a south-facing field. Uba chama zorachat u'mimena chama shokat. Right, the sun rises and sets while it's on the south side of the sky. Nar chetzia v'zoreh chetzia. Nar chetzia v'zoreh chetzia. Now we're going to see again this idea that they would plant the field they would plow it for the first half of the year, then plant only half. Then the next year they would plant the other half of the field after they plowed the whole field, and then likewise the year after. He had this land, a piece of a field, like a section of a field. He did exactly this suggestion. He did it right 1 year that way, 1 year the other side. He basically produced double the amount of grains by doing it like this. And he sold this wheat for smida, for this special flour. Okay. Rashi says smida. Rashi in Ketav Yad says solet linkor la'ashirim v'lo lemenachot lefi she'einam b'yamav. Okay, he sold it. The smida is really the same as the solet, but he wasn't selling it for minchas because they weren't doing minchas in his day. The point is, he used this not for the minchas. He used it as a good business suggestion. He was able to produce tons of grains and sold them for a lot of money to wealthy people. Okay, moving on. V'im hitzlia psula. If it gets worms in it, it's ruined. Tanu Rabbanan, solet she'itzlia ruba psula. If you have solet where the majority of it became worm infested, even if you take out the bad solet, it still ruins the whole thing. And you could say, I have a minority of it left, but that one doesn't have worms in it. No, we throw out the whole thing. Bechitim she'itzlia rubam psulot. And if you have grains, the wheat kernels that also got worms in the majority of them, it's disqualified. But by Rabbi Yirmiyah asked a question about this. When you say berov chitim, what do you mean? Rov solet, obviously, it's a pile of solet, and the majority of it. But what about the grains? There's 2 ways to read it. The classic Rabbi Yirmiyah question: berov chita or berov se'ah? Do you mean if you have the majority of a kernel, then you have to throw out that kernel? Or do you mean, right, if the majority of it was worm infested, or does it mean the majority of a pile of wheat had worms, then we throw out the whole pile? Because in solet, it's very fine and you end up with it all kind of mixed in. But the grains, each one is individual. So maybe you wouldn't say we have to throw out the ones that weren't worm infested. So we left with a teku. And we're going to have some other questions now that are left with teku. By Rava. Rava asked, Hikdishan maushil kalehem mishum balmum. Okay, we're going to learn in Tmura. There's 5 lo tases you can transgress by bringing a balmum on the mizbech. So if you bring wheat that was rotten, okay, in a way that it's problematic, that it was worm infested, and you dedicated it anyway, is that considered like a blemish by an animal, right? It's like an analogy. A blemish to an animal is like worms to grains. So, kevan de pasil kebalmum dami, since it's disqualified, we treat it like a balmum. O dilma ein balmum ela bebehemar. Maybe we say balmum is only an issue by animals. Tanan hatam, another Mishnah. Kol et shenimtza bo tola pasul legabe mizbech. Any wood that has, again, that's worm infested, well, it's disqualified for the altar. Remember, there was all this wood they would bring for the altar. For burning, you can't bring it if it has worms. Amar Shmuel lo shanu elalach. That's only if it's soft, if it's moist. Aval yavesh, but if it's dry wood, go kasher. You just scrape it off and it's fine. By Rava, Rava again asks, Hikdisho, what if you did it anyway, if it was moist and it had worms, and you brought it to sanctify for the altar? Maushil ke'alav mishum balmum, you get lashes because it's blemished. Again, same 2 sides. Kevan de pasul kebalmum dami, o dilma ein balmum ela bepehema. And they left with teku. Again, they say, do we say it's disqualified and therefore it's a problem? Or do we say it's only balmum by animals? Okay, Mishnah. Tkoa alpha l'shem. Rabbi Abba Shaul Omer, Shniala Regev Be'ever HaYarden. So Tekoa is the best for oil, and we're going to have a whole story about it. Abba Shaul says, no, the second to Tekoa is Regev in the Ever HaYarden. Kol Aratzot HaYuksherot, Elamikana Yumavim. So this mission is very much like the previous. There's ideal places you bring it from. You could bring it from the other places, but best to bring it from these. And that's where people really would be bringing them. Emivim, and same as the previous, lomi betas valim, velomi betas shlachim, now from a field. So again, you don't bring the oil. Now we're just talking about oil, not grains. You don't bring the oil not from a field that's that's fertilized, not from betas shlachim, from an irrigated field, velomi mashin izra benehem. And not if you have trees, these are trees. So not if you have crops growing among the trees, because again, they soak up the nutrients. Here you see, by the way, the issue isn't that it shades. The issue is the nutrients more so. And the other one, it could have been one or the other. V'im hevi kasher, but if you brought anyway, it's fine. Ein mevi'in ampaktan, oil that's called ampaktan. We're going to see later in the Gemara, not today, what that is. V'im hevi kasher, but if you brought it, it's fine. Ein mevi'im min hagargarin. Okay, but here, by the way, I think it's here. Second, one of these has a different girsa. Ein mevi'im min hagargarim. I think, one second, let me just double check. I think here there's a girsa that basically says that it's actually no good. Yeah. If you bring from ampankan, there's a problem in the girsa. B'diavad, is it okay or is it actually still disqualified? The you can't bring from olives that were soaked in water or that were pickled or that were boiled. The assumption of some of the commentaries is the reason people did this was because they weren't so good and the only way to get the oil out of them was to do this process. So that already means they're second rate and therefore you don't bring these. Again, we're talking about oil to use on the altar. So you can't use, right, for oil libations. Can't use something that's second rate. And if you did, it's disqualified. Okay, now we're going to have a Gemara because we talked about Tekoa. Vayishlach Yoav Tekoa. We're going to bring a pasuk from Sefer Shmuel Bet. Vayishlach Yoav Tekoa. Vayikach Misha Misha Chachamai. Brings us this wise woman from Tekoa. Why was the woman wise from Tekoa? Maishna Tekoa. Why does it tell you specifically why did he go to Tekoa to get it? Amar Rabbi Yochanan mitoch sheregilim b'shemen zayit chachama metzuya behen. Okay, there's this connection between olive oil, and they eat a lot of olive oil, therefore they're wiser. Tanu Rabbanan v'tovel b'shemen raglo. It's the bracha for Asher in Sefer Dvarim, in V'zot bracha, with all the brachot for the tribes. Zechel koshel Asher shemoshech shemen k'ma'ayan. Okay, it has oil like a stream. Okay, tons of oil. Amru, they told the story. The people in Ludkia needed oil. They took a Gentile officer and said, can you be our messenger? Amrulo, or I don't know if he was an officer or some sort of name, this Pomustus, whatever that means, okay, like a person in charge of something. Amrulo, lech va'velanu shemen b'mea ribo. Go buy us oil in the quantity for 100, okay, for a million, mea ribo maneh. I think it's a million maneh. Should just double check that, but a million maneh. That's a lot of money, okay, because a maneh is 100 dinarim. So they wanted that kind of huge quantity of oil. Halach Yerushalayim. So he went to Jerusalem to get oil. Amrulo lech litzol. They said go to Tzol. That's by Lebanon. Halach litzol. Amrulo lech legush chalav. Okay, gush chalav is in the area of. It's in the Galil area. Halach legush chalav. Okay, the point is it's in the tribe of Asher. Okay. Now, halach legush chalav. Amrulo lech etzel ploni. So when he gets to gush chalav, they say go to this person's field. L'sadeh halas. Okay, go to this person in this field. Mitzao shaya ozek tachat zeitav. See, he found him hoeing by his olive trees. Amar lo, yesh cha shemen b'mei ribo shani tzarich. He says, I want to buy 1,000,000 manez worth. Do you have for me? Now, just imagine, you go to this, you assume he's a wealthy guy if he's the guy who's got that kind of oil, and he sees the guy hoeing, like he's doing all the work himself. Amar lo, hamten li ad shesei melachti. He says, listen, just wait till I finish my job, my work. So he finishes till he waits there till he finishes his work. When he finishes his work, he puts his stuff over his shoulder, like you imagine a beggar kind of thing, his stuff over his shoulder. And as he walks, he's moving stones off like he's still working. Okay. This Gentile guy says, listen. Okay, now whether he says it to himself or he says it to the guy, he probably more likely says it to himself, which some of the commentaries read it like that. He says to himself, this guy has shemen b'mei ribo, is that much oil? And I think the Jews are pulling the wool over my eyes. They sent me to this guy, but this guy doesn't have what, he's a poor guy doing some work here. So Kevan Shigel Iro, when he gets to his city, Hotzialo Shifchato, because remember the fields are outside the city. Hotzialo Shifchato Kumkum Shel Chamim V'Rachatz Bo Yadav Raglav. So now we see this person has a maid woman a woman in his house that works for him. She takes out hot water. She washes his hands and feet. Hotzialo Sefer Shel Zahav. She takes out a golden cup filled with Mele'ah Shemen, filled with oil. V'Taval Bo Yadav Raglav, and she dips his hands and feet in it. And that is a fulfillment of that pasuk, tovel b'shem raglo. Okay, that you dip your feet in oil. That's how much oil they had. Now you start to see this guy really did have what it takes. After they ate and drank, he measures him out the amount that he wanted. Amarlo, is it possible you even want more? Amarlo, he said, yeah, sure, I'll take more. He says, but you know what? I don't have the money for it. Amarlo, if you want to take. I'll go with you back to your town and I'll get the money for it. Okay, so he measures him an extra 18, which is 18 ribo, which is 180,000. The way they tell the story, in order to carry all this stuff back to Ludkia, he had to hire out every donkey, every horse, every mule, every camel that was in the city of Israel. Obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but Kevan Shigia Li'iro, when he gets to a city, I mean, you've got to imagine that the amount of oil he gave him was probably also an exaggeration. Hard to imagine he gave him 1,180,000 manez worth of oil. Kevan Shigia Li'iro, Yatsu Anshe Yiro L'Kaso, when he gets to the city, the people were praising him, amazing, this non-Jewish guy, he was able to bring back all this oil for us. Amar Lahem, Lo Li Kasuni, Elazeh Shabayimi, don't praise me, praise this guy. Then the Gentile was so taken with the other guy. First of all, how simple he was, and yet he had all this oil. He was super wealthy. And let's go praise this guy who gave me oil exactly the amount we wanted, and even gave me more, and now I owe him this money. This fulfills, right? This person fulfills the pasuk, yesh mit asher, or the thing that people say, yesh mit asher. It's a pasuk in Mishlei. Yesh mit asher ve'en kol. There's people who are wealthy and have nothing. Mit roshesh v'hon rav. There's people who are live in poverty or look impoverished or feel impoverished, but they actually have everything. In other words, look at this person. He looks like a simple guy, but he actually has hon rav, he has great wealth. Okay, with that, we finished our daf. So very interesting daf. Interesting way to end, kind of a message about how to live your life and, how sometimes Gentiles, right? It's a very positive Gentile story about how he came and he did this for the Jews. He had that little moment where he kind of thought the Jews were mocking him, but in the end, he comes out and gives them exactly what they want and shows how much he respects this other person. Okay, so we talked about the Teven Asamachnis La'afarayim from Moshe Rabbeinu, and that whole, right? We finished up where Rabbi Yochanan had said, oh, it's a Machloket Tanaim. We then went on to the Afarayim and how that was known to have Teven, and we got to that little quip about Moshe. Then we got to the Mishnah where we saw two parallel Mishnayot really about where you can't bring not wheat or not oil for the temple from certain places that don't grow it properly, from certain types of fields. We talked about the plowing, and then we had two ways of reading the Mishnah, which we then resolved. And then we got to, and we want always south-facing fields. We got to the worms, and then we had a whole slew of questions about that. And from there, we ended about how the section of Asher has tons of oil and how that's the praiseworthy, the best of the oils can be found there. And with that, we had a whole story to illustrate that. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day. Moadim l'simcha.